They say some secrets are buried to protect the world, but others are buried to protect you from yourself. Imagine this. 3 newborns born beneath the floorboards of a hidden Quaker meeting house during a night when bloodhounds were already on the hunt. No cries, no screams, just silence, like they already knew what was coming. This isn't a story, it's a warning. In the frozen winter of 1856, southeastern Ohio became the unwilling host to a phenomenon that even now, 169 years later, science refuses to confront. These were not normal children. Not then. Not ever. And the woman who bore them was not running from slavery alone. She was running from something far older, far darker, something that chose her for what she carried. When her sons were born, they didn't wail. They opened their eyes and watched. You're not supposed to know what happened next, because what they could do, what they became, threatens the entire structure of how we define human limitation. That's why the records were buried, that's why the family line was hidden, and that's why tonight you are in danger of never seeing the world the same way again. Cedar Mills, Ohio, 1856. A place so small it barely cast a shadow on the map. Yet on one bitter February night, it became the epicenter of a mystery powerful enough to unmake what you think you know about birth, mind, and destiny. Beneath the wooden floorboards of Station 14, one of the most secretive hubs in the Underground Railroad, a young woman gave birth to 3 sons. Her name was Ruth. No last name, no documents, no origin anyone could confirm, just Ruth, and a look in her eyes that said she was carrying more than babies. The birth defied everything. No pain, no blood-curdling screams, no panic, just silence. Controlled, calculated, like ritual. And when they came, those triplets, they didn't cry. They breathed in, eyes wide open, and turned, their heads in perfect synchrony, to the ceiling, as if listening to the footsteps above, as if they already knew. Above them, slave catchers tore the meeting house apart. Bloodhounds sniffed, boots thundered, and yet the basement held its breath. No sounds, no mistakes. The children, not minutes old, somehow understood. Survival required silence, stillness, awareness. What kind of minds are born already knowing what most men die, never understanding? Ruth bled out less than an hour after her sons entered the world. 3 perfect boys, wide-eyed, watchful, whispering in a tongue no one recognized, fluid, soft, almost aquatic. Her last words weren't maternal, they were prophetic. They'll always know. Take care of them. But remember, they're not like other children. The Quaker community was paralyzed. What do you do with 3 infants born in secrecy, without documentation, to a mother whose past was a blank slate? Ohio soil meant they were technically free, but in 1856, freedom was a fragile lie. Samuel Whitmore, the elder who oversaw the station, made a decision that would haunt every man and woman in Cedar Mills. The community would raise the boys together, as sons, as secrets. They named them Caleb, Ezra, Isaac. But the names didn't matter, because within weeks it became clear. These boys were not learning the world, they were remembering it. Before they could speak, they watched people too closely. They knew when someone was lying. They reacted not to what was said, but to what was meant. Most babies cry when scared. These 3 only stared, as if fear was already beneath them, as if the world was trying to catch up, and failing. By their first birthday, the town had already split into 2 camps, those who believed the boys were a blessing, and those who feared them. Because it wasn't just that they reacted to lies, it was how they reacted. A man would enter the meeting house and say he was from Cleveland. The triplets would turn their heads away, together, and stare at the door until he left. Later, it would always be revealed. The man wasn't from Cleveland, and he wasn't there to help. The pattern repeated, over and over, No training, no prompting, just instinct. Perfect, unbroken instinct. But it didn't stop with deception. Soon, they began sensing something deeper, something darker. One winter evening, a traveling merchant named Thompson visited. The boys wouldn't go near him. They screamed if he entered the room. They didn't eat, didn't sleep, just watched him with those endless, knowing eyes. 2 weeks later, news came. Thompson had been arrested for murder. His business partner's body had been in his wagon. The entire time he was in Cedar Mills. They weren't just sensing lies anymore. They were feeling intent, like a radar for hidden guilt. Not children, not prophets, something in between and outside. By the time they were 3, even the most skeptical among the Quakers had stopped calling it coincidence, because the triplets, Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac, had developed what the townspeople whispered about as the knowing look. It always happened the same way. A stranger would speak, and the boys would pause whatever they were doing, turn their heads at the same time, lock their eyes, black, wide, unreadable, onto the man or woman speaking. Then they'd whisper to one another, but not in English, not in any known dialect. It was that language again, Ruth's language, the one she used while giving birth, a sound like water over stone, flowing, measured, eternal. Most children babble. These 3, they conferred. Dr. William Harrison, a physician from the nearby township, was called in to observe them. His findings were written in a letter, never published, only uncovered decades later. These children demonstrate perceptual abilities that exceed all known psychological frameworks. They sense guilt like heat. They hear tension in silence. Either they are not human in the way we define it, or we have profoundly misunderstood the boundaries of cognition. He never returned to Cedar Mills, but in that letter he left behind a sentence that still burns. I fear what they will become when they learn to use what they know. Knowledge, when pure, isolates, and by 4 years old, the triplets had become utterly alone in a village that raised them. Other children wouldn't play with them, not out of cruelty, but instinct. Even the kindest soul could feel it. Being watched by them was like being seen by something older, something that didn't need your words to know your truth. Adults fared no better. A man would walk into the meeting house full of good intentions, but if he harbored one buried doubt, one unspoken anger, one memory he hadn't forgiven himself for, the triplets would know. And they would look at him. That look, that terrifying surgical stillness, like 3 tiny judges who already knew your verdict. Samuel Whitmore once confessed to his journal, "Even I, who love them as my own, feel stripped bare in their presence, not because they condemn, but because I know they could." They never accused, never punished, but their silence was a mirror, and most men cannot bear their own reflection. And yet, it was precisely that power that turned Cedar Mills into the safest station on the Underground Railroad, because in a world of betrayal and lies, 3 boys had become the last defense against the darkness of men's hearts. The Underground Railroad was built on trust, and trust was always the weakest link, but not in Cedar Mills, because there, the triplets were more than children. They were instruments of truth, living detectors of corruption. And word spread. Freedom seekers began requesting that their routes pass through Station 14, not because it was safer, but because of the boys. "If they let you through," conductors whispered, "you're clean. If they don't, you were never one of us." It should have been a blessing, but power, real power, carries a cost. By age 5, the triplets had stopped speaking to anyone but each other. Their language had evolved, no longer just whispers. It was structure, rhythm, something deeper than words. Martha Whitmore described it as listening to the architecture of thought. They didn't sleep like other children. Sometimes they'd sit upright for hours in the dark, eyes open, perfectly still, breathing in unison, waiting, listening. One night, Martha found them standing outside her bedroom door. "There's a man in the woods," Ezra whispered. "He's thinking about fire." The next morning they found the charred remains of a torch behind the meeting house. They hadn't seen him. They'd felt him. They weren't just reading people anymore. They were intercepting intention. By 6, the triplets weren't just sensing intentions. They were anticipating them. A thought didn't have to be spoken. It didn't even have to be fully formed. It was enough to feel it. And they would know. Martha once described watching Isaac touch a visitor's hand. Just once. Then recoil in silence. Minutes later the man's face broke. He confessed, sobbing, that he had once betrayed a group of freedom seekers in exchange for money. He had traveled to Cedar Mills to make amends, he said. The triplets had known, before he did. But here's the darker truth, what no one wanted to admit. The boys weren't deciding to judge, they were absorbing, holding every lie, every wound, every darkness that passed through the station left a mark, not on the adults, on them. Their silence grew heavier, their eyes darker. They began sketching strange symbols in the dirt, symbols no one recognized but all felt were wrong. Twisting, geometric, like maps of thoughts not meant for human minds. Samuel started locking his journals in a box beneath the floorboards, not to keep the world from reading them, but to keep the boys from knowing what he wrote. Because now, even thinking the wrong thing made the house feel unsafe. There's a moment in every haunting when the walls stop holding, when reality, stretched too thin, begins to fray. Cedar Mills reached that moment in the winter of 1861. The boys had turned 7, but they no longer behaved like boys. They moved with the precision of a unit, spoke in phrases that seemed half-remembered from dreams. More disturbing still, they began asking questions about things no one had ever told them. They asked Martha about her dead brother, one she'd never spoken of. They asked Samuel about a tunnel that no longer existed, one that had collapsed 30 years earlier. And one night, they asked a freedom seeker if he had considered poisoning his master. The man dropped to his knees in horror. He had. He'd never told a soul. How did they know? You can't call it telepathy. That's too small, too clean. This was deeper, like they had access to echoes not just of minds, but of time, as if memory, intention, and guilt were all part of the same river, and they were standing in it. And then came the drawings. Hundreds of them, in charcoal, on walls, on wood, spiral patterns, eyes, maps with no legend, not symbols of madness, but structure, like blueprints. To what? That's what terrified Samuel most. Spring of 1862 brought something Cedar Mills had never seen before. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, the oppressive, unnatural kind. Animals stopped coming near. Wind didn't pass through the trees. And inside the station house, the triplets stopped speaking entirely. They no longer responded to names, no longer played. They would sit for hours, fingers intertwined, eyes closed, as if listening to something beneath the floorboards, something none of the others could hear. And then, the incidents began. First, the clocks. Every time a lie was spoken in the house, every clock, no matter how old or new, would stop. Samuel documented 17 such occurrences in his journal. He changed the clocks, burned them, replaced them. But it didn't matter. The phenomenon wasn't mechanical, it was psychic. Next came the visions. Martha would wake in the middle of the night, convinced she'd heard a voice whispering her name, not from outside, but from under the bed. Guests reported dreams of standing in tunnels they'd never seen, always lit by a flickering blue glow, always echoing with the sound of children, singing in a language they couldn't understand. The triplets had become conduits, not just for truth, but for something older, something that had been waiting, and now, through them, it had a foothold. June 1862. A visitor arrived in the dead of night. He didn't knock, didn't ask permission. He walked straight into the Whitmore home as if he'd been there before. Tall, gaunt, dressed in grey. He claimed to be a scholar from the East. His name, if it was his real one, was Elijah Trenholm. But Samuel didn't believe him, not for a second. Trenholm didn't ask about the Underground Railroad, didn't ask about safe routes or the war. He asked only one thing: when did they stop being yours? He was talking about the Triplets. He spent 4 hours with them behind closed doors. No one knows what was said. But when he emerged, he was pale, sweating, shaking. He handed Samuel a folded piece of paper and whispered, "Do not let them near the river. Not on the solstice." Then he left. The paper contained 3 things: a diagram of the boys' charcoal patterns, translated into coordinates; a phrase written in Latin, "Memoria non est privata," memory is not private, and beneath that, a symbol burned into the page, circular, endless, like a snake eating its own tail, but composed entirely of eyes. Samuel burned the page, but he burned it too late. The boys had already drawn that exact symbol on the ceiling above their bed. June 20th, 1862, the night before the summer solstice. Samuel bolted every door, covered every window. For the first time in his life, he believed the station might need protection, not from the outside world, but from what was already inside. The Triplets hadn't eaten in 2 days. They weren't sick. They were preparing. For what, no one could say. They barely moved, barely blinked. They only hummed, softly, rhythmically, in that alien cadence. A sound that made the hairs on Martha's arms rise like static, a sound that felt like remembering something you were never supposed to know. Then came midnight. Every candle in the house extinguished at once. No wind, no hands, just silence, and then footsteps, from the floorboards, from the walls, from beneath. Martha screamed. The boys stood up in unison and turned their heads toward the window. The moonlight had turned blue, cold, almost metallic. Outside, the trees bent unnaturally, not from the wind, but like they were bowing. Samuel reached for his rifle, but Ezra turned to him and calmly whispered, "You can't stop memory, Papa. It's already here." And then, the house began to shake, not violently but rhythmically, like a heartbeat, not theirs, not God's. Something older, something that had been waiting beneath the soil of Cedar Mills for a very long time. The ground split at 3:09 a.m., not an earthquake, not a collapse, a seam opening directly beneath the house, as if the earth itself had been stitched shut long ago, and the thread finally snapped. And from that seam came whispers, not in English, not in any known tongue. But the Triplets understood. They descended into the basement barefoot, without light, without fear. Samuel screamed for them to stop. Martha grabbed Isaac's arm, but the moment she did, she saw something that should have been impossible. She saw her own childhood, her mother's death, the first time she ever lied. All flashing through her mind in less than a second, not as memories, but as data, catalogued, measured, filed. The boys weren't just conduits now. They were vessels, carriers of memory not bound by time. And from that seam, in the cracked stone beneath the house, they uncovered something. Not an object, but a space, a hollow cavity lined with symbols older than the village, carved into the very bedrock. Spirals, eyes, the Ouroboros, over and over and over. And in the center, a pool, still, black, reflective, but not water. Something thicker, something that seemed to respond when the boys came near. Samuel would later write, "It looked at us, through its own surface, and it knew our names." They hadn't summoned it. It had been remembering them all along. They stepped into the pool, one by one. No hesitation, no fear, as if returning to something they'd only ever glimpsed in dreams. The liquid didn't ripple, didn't splash. It welcomed them, like a door recognizing its key. Martha screamed. Samuel lunged forward, but the moment he touched the surface, he was thrown back across the room, not by force, by rejection. The pool wasn't meant for him. Then the light changed. The walls of the chamber glowed faintly, illuminating not just symbols, but faces, etched in the rock. Hundreds of them, wide-eyed, silent, ageless, watching. Some bore resemblance to the triplets, others to people long dead, some to people who had never been born. Time collapsed. For exactly 37 minutes, the triplets floated between worlds. Their bodies remained, but their minds, their memories, traveled. Through pain, through war, through betrayals yet to come. They didn't just see the past, they became it. When they emerged, they weren't the same. They spoke differently, slower, with an accent no one could place. They knew things, names of ancestors long forgotten, secrets of the land, the exact day the Whitmore line would end. And Ezra turned to Samuel and said, "We're not your sons, we're your mirror. Everything you've hidden, we remember." Then they began to draw again, but this time, it wasn't on the walls, it was on themselves. They carved the symbols into their own skin. Not in pain, not in protest, but in precision, as if following a diagram etched into their blood. Spirals on the chest, the endless eye on the spine, Latin phrases across the ribs, phrases no one in Cedar Mills could translate, not even the preacher. Samuel tried to stop them, tried to bathe them, hide the markings, but within a day, the carvings healed, leaving no scars, only darkened skin, almost inked, like birthmarks, with intention. And then the others began dreaming, dozens across town, even those who'd never met the triplets, dreams of corridors that curved forever, dreams of figures trapped in mirrors, knocking from the inside, dreams of their own deaths, played in reverse from coffin to cradle. One man, Luther Hayes, slit his own throat in church. When they opened his palm, they found the Ouroboros scratched into the skin. No one knew how it got there. The town began to unravel. Children stopped speaking. Dogs refused to enter the woods. A woman gave birth to twins, and claimed they spoke to her from the womb in a voice that wasn't hers. And every night, the triplets stood silently on the hill above the house, eyes closed, whispering into the dark. They weren't trying to summon anything. They were answering. August 3rd, 1862. The town woke to silence. No birds, no wind, no sound at all, except for a low hum like breath beneath the earth. Samuel and Martha were gone. Their house stood empty, dishes on the table, chairs knocked over, the cellar door wide open, but no footprints. Only a single phrase carved into the wall above the mantel. "We are what you buried." The triplets were seen last standing in the cornfield behind the chapel, hands clasped, heads tilted skyward. The sky itself seemed wrong, too flat, too close, like canvas stretched thin. Then, at exactly noon, the ground split again. But not just beneath the house. All across Cedar Mills, cracks in the road, fissures through gravestones. And from those cracks came not lava nor smoke, but light. A cold white light, filled with images, flickering faster than thought. Families saw their darkest sins projected into the air, every hidden act, every silenced scream, all memory made public. People ran, screamed, some clawed their own eyes, some dropped to their knees and begged the boys to stop. But they didn't. Because they weren't boys anymore. They were archives, living vaults of forgotten sin, repositories of the unspoken, mirrors for mankind's denial. By nightfall, 143 people had vanished. The government sealed off Cedar Mills, called it a quarantine, but no illness was found. Only one survivor remained, an old blind man muttering to himself by the well. He kept repeating, "Memory is the god beneath the god," and the boys were his priests.